Okay, as you know, this series of classes, we did this last year, and people who learned about the class over time then joined, and it was a series of three classes, three sessions with 8 classes per session. And so for people who joined late, and we decided to offer the series of classes again, so that they would get the whole picture. And as we move along, there may be fewer and fewer people in attendance because they're coming up to the point where they joined the class before. However, as some of you will know, I always add different things as we whenever we do a repeat class. I try to add some new twists to it. And overall, what I've wanted to communicate is looking at that big, broader picture that our human experience changed considerably when we became civilized. And civilized meant the transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculturalist and pastoralist. Pastoralist being harnessing animals for work and as a source of food. So when we made that transition, and it opened a path for a more controlled environment where humans would thrive, it also unleashed the phenomenon of excess, wealth, power, and greed. And over time, over the past 10,000 years, those aspects have predominated civilization. I'll have people who will, let's say, come from the British Empire, who will then say, oh, well, you're saying there wasn't anything good about colonialism. And my answer is, you are correct. There was nothing good about colonialism. And they will say, well, but we brought them, civilization and advanced societies at the cost of massive bloodshed and brutality. So I went on, I've created a list before for the 19th century about the wars and the death toll and all of that, because that was a particularly bloody time. And I decided to take a look at a longer term, see what data is available. And I thought this would project okay, but it really doesn't. But it goes back to 550 before the current era. So we're not going all the way back 10,000 years, not even close to it, about 2,500 years. So, and mind you, the world population is much smaller at that time than it is now. So when you look at 100,000 people killed, that's a very significant number at that point in time, because there's so many fewer people. But I just want to show quickly that, we have, here we have the Punic Wars, which are the Rome fighting the Carthaginians empire. And there we get up to 2 million people killed. We can go on, and just looking at the millions, we have the Gallic Wars. This was the fight between Rome and the Gallic tribes. This is also known as the Garlic Wars. No, they're not. But, and then we have the Jewish-Roman Wars. There's another 2 million people killed. 2 million people. And mind you, we're just getting into the current era, right? And the Three Kingdoms War, this is in China. These are, again, the kingdoms. This is the emperor. This is the person who's at the top of excess, wealth, power. This is the greedy leader who is now warring against some. We have 40 million people killed in 184 to 280, the years 184 to 280. We got the Yellow Turban Rebellion, 7 million people. That's going back a long way. Then we have the Reconquista. This was Spain and Portugal fighting Islam, 10 million people. Here's another one in China, 36 million people. Understand, our human experience is loaded with massive death. And what happens with some of these is that we'll focus on one as if it is an exception to all the others. And we'll kind of look at one war at the exclusion of all others, and as if, World War II was the worst thing that ever happened. It's one of the worst things that ever happened, but it ain't 100 years war. Here's another 3 million. Here's the conquest of the Timurid Empire, 20 million people killed. So, we get into India and Bangladesh, there's 5 million. We go on. I mean, these are millions and millions of people who are decimated by World War I. We got 16 to 20 million, I believe it is. Yeah, 16 to 40 million in World War I. Russian Civil War, 10 million people. So the point is that this phenomenon of warfare, of feeding the greed of those who want ever greater wealth and power, is the disease that we're dealing with. It's not race. It's not, this country against that. It is fundamentally the people who have gained that power are using it, and they're using it to create a world that is pretty dangerous. So today we're going to talk about the French and Indian War. And in American history, we focus on the French and Indian War. And I'm suggesting we not really just focus on the French and Indian War, because it is much bigger than that. It is a worldwide war. What we have is Britain, France, and Spain. By the time we get to the 18th century, Britain, France, and Spain are the people who are competing for who's going to have control. And they haven't, mind you, they've come into the New World under the Doctrine of Discovery, as this is for ours for the taking, and we're blessed by God in doing it. And they don't have a detailed business plan for what they want to achieve. They just kind of stumble through it, and they wind up fighting with each other because, you're crossing into my territory, I'm crossing into your territory, and so you have these fights. And so we have fights over the fur trade. We have fights over boundaries with Canada. The navies are fighting with each other for control over the oceans and the seas. The Spanish have conflicts with everywhere they've gone in the Americas. And meanwhile, Frederick the Great. How many people think of in our recent American history, some leader who may want to be referred to as blank the Great. So Frederick the Great of Germany, I think it was Prussia at that time, was fighting against Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden, Austrian secession. These are all countries that are in conflict. And what's the conflict over? Again, it is taking more land and the resources that are involved there, invading countries to enslave populations and put them to work for you. This is what is happening. So, again, we have what could be really, the first French-Indian War is King William's War. 1689, 1697. This is 17th century. And this is taking place on the North American continent, and they're fighting over the fur trade. Who's got control over it? Then we have Queen Anne's War. Again, England and France competing over boundaries. What's ours? What's yours? They're fighting over the Canada boundary. Then we have King George's War that precedes the French Indian War of 1756 to 1763. So I want to take you into what is the French and Indian War, but I want you to understand this is within the context of the major powers flexing their muscles, trying to take control.
You British and the French are like the two edges of a pair of shears, and we are the cloth which is cut to pieces between them. Odawa.
By the mid-1700s, the Indian nations of the eastern interior were surrounded by European powers. Spain controlled Florida. The English were pressing in from their colonies in the east, and the French were aggressively moving across the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River. Spurred by the increasingly lucrative fur trade, along with valuable farmlands, North America was seen by the Europeans as a commercial prize. To win it, the French and English established military outposts throughout the interior to support their trading ventures and solidify their claims to the land.
This idea of encroachment and land ownership and so forth was so foreign to us that we couldn't understand it. As individuals, we couldn't understand it. It was carving up our mother's breast. It was parceling out the land and the air above it to individual ownership.
In 1754, France and England clashed for control over the continent in what would become known as the French and Indian War. From Europe, the American conflict was seen as a distant chess match for territory, power, and trade, with Indian nations mere fighting pawns. But in America, the interior Indian nations saw their homelands turned into violent battlegrounds.
Why do not you and the French fight in the old country and on the sea? Why do you come to fight in our land? Shingas Lenape.
Most Indian nations joined the war on the side of the French.
We had a very close affinity to the French people. The reason is because they had no designs on our territory. They were not out to colonize. If they wanted to live with us, they married into the tribe, and they lived with us, and they were welcome. On the other hand, at the other end of the scale, the English are notorious for being colonists. They don't want the sun to set on the British Empire, so they want colonies everywhere. And this new world was no different. That's why they came.
In 1760, after 6 years of war, the French shocked their Indian allies in the Ohio Valley and the western Great Lakes by abruptly withdrawing from the region. While the French continued to fight for other parts of the continent, here the English army moved into their abandoned forts unopposed.
Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none.
One Odawa man, who had fought alongside the French, then watched them retreat, refused to abandon the struggle. His name was Pontiac.
On the night he was born, there was snow and rain and winds. There was lightning and thunder, and there were shooting stars. And all of the phenomena that was taking place that night The elders said that there was a great person being born.
While many leaders saw the English as a threat to their nations, Pontiac saw the English as a threat to all Indian people. Nations had to put aside the past and unite in common purpose. Pontiac's vision would change the thinking of Indian leaders for generations.
So what he did was to organize his own thoughts and then organize his own people and then other tribes, got them together with what undoubtedly had to be great oratory and great diplomatic moves and skills to get people, some of whom were his bitter enemies, our tribe's bitter enemies. We fought the Hurons for hundreds of years. We fought the Shawnees. We fought many of these tribes. He went around and got them to become part of what's known as Pontiac's Confederacy.
It is important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from our land this nation which only seeks to kill us. When I go to the English chief to tell him that some of our comrades are dead, instead of weeping, he makes fun of me and of you. When I ask him for something for our sick, he refuses and tells me that he has no need of us. There is no more time to lose, and when the English shall be defeated, we shall cut off the passage so they cannot come back to our country. Pontiac, Odawa.
Fighting men from the Anishinaabe, Miami, Seneca, Lenape, Shawnee, and other nations responded to his call. In May of 1763, Pontiac's rebellion erupted with the siege of Fort Detroit. Over the next 2 months, 9 of the 11 English forts in the region fell. Only Detroit and Fort Pitt remained in British hands, both under siege by Pontiac's alliance.
And he started taking the British forts, and he took them one by one, cut off the security of the colonists. Then they were on their own. Then his vision was that once we get the last one, once we get Detroit, we will start and we will just kind of herd them ahead of us like ducks or geese, right back to the Atlantic Ocean.
Pontiac stood on the verge of total victory. With France still in control of Louisiana and the Mississippi, local French residents assured him that French forces would soon return to the region to help him drive out the English once and for all. But unknown to Pontiac, France had already signed a treaty of surrender in Paris, ending all hostilities between the two colonial powers in North America. Rumors of the accord reached Pontiac in June, at the height of his triumph, but he refused to believe that the French would not respond to his victories. The British Army, freed from campaigns against the French, launched massive expeditions against the Indian forces. But Pontiac's alliance held their ground. Increasingly desperate to prevail, British commander Geoffrey Amherst put a bounty on Pontiac's head, then proposed a sinister tactic, germ warfare.
Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must, on this occasion, use every stratagem in our power to reduce them. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, to try to extirpate this execrable race.
Shawnee, Lenape, and Odawa were crippled by smallpox-infested blankets from Fort Pitt.
Pretty soon burst out a terrible sickness among us. Lodge after lodge was totally vacated. Nothing but the dead bodies lying here and there in their lodges. Entire families being swept off with the ravages of this terrible disease.
In October, confirmation of the French surrender reached Pontiac and his allies. The news was a decisive blow to the momentum of the rebellion. Now they knew that help would never come. Pontiac called off the siege of Detroit and retired with his people to their winter camps. The next spring, he tried to rally forces for another push against the English, but his efforts were ineffective. Many Indian nations were encouraged by English promises that settlements would never be allowed on their land. They were also anxious to normalize relations and to resume European trade. With the passage of another year, Pontiac was a leader without a following. His moment had passed. The British forts were there to stay. In 1769, only 6 years after the incredible success of his campaign against the British, Pontiac died, murdered in the ancient Indian center of Cahokia. But his life had not been in vain. His vision of united Indian nations would echo through the region and across the coming decades.
The idea didn't die. The idea that Pontiac had implanted with these other leaders and these other tribes prevailed.
Pontiac's life was a message to the future. But before the nations of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley would rise again, the continent would be embroiled in another costly war, this time between the American colonists and their king.
Part of the reason for my making the French Indian War as one of the pillars of American history is that it is the consequence of this war becomes one of the major motivations for the American Revolution. And as he says there, they, you know, they're not done fighting now because they're going to soon be fighting against their king. And so I want to get to this quickly, and I should country between. Okay, so get this ready. Okay, so what we have, again, we're going to go back over fighting over the Ohio River Valley, which is what the French and Indian War becomes the major thrust of that confrontation. And mind you, the British, they are laying claim on the basis of exploration, invasion by John Cabot. The French are basing their claim on their exploration invasion by LaSalle. And what you have is the natives, the people who are the indigenous peoples, they, when the invaders came in, they saw there were those who saw some benefit in being able to trade for European products and that kind of stuff. So they couldn't coalesce around the idea of this foreign invader is going to kill us and take over. And because they couldn't, by the time they realize what they're into, it is too little and it is too late.
To understand how young George Washington could set such momentous events into motion, we have to go back in time, before he blundered into battle, and see how the stage had already been set for war. Spring 1752, 2 years before George Washington's battle in the woods. Speculators from Washington's native Virginia are coming to Pennsylvania to negotiate with the region's Indians for land. They're after a foothold in one of the most contested regions of North America. In the 1750s, Britain holds the East Coast, while Canada and the Mississippi Valley are dominated by the French. Between those two empires lies a giant prize called the Ohio Country, a region the size of France that is largely empty and up for grabs. Both France and Britain set their sights on one spot in particular: a strategic river junction called the Forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh stands today. But the Forks of the Ohio isn't theirs for the taking. The native people consider this their land and not something that can be traded or sold. But there is one Indian leader in the region who is willing to talk. The Half-King, the same man who will play such an important role in George Washington's life 2 years later.
Eswahe, don't ever forget that any sign of friendship that we make to the English will not escape the French.
But the French seem weak, while the English traders give us goods when our hunters bring the skins.
In native tradition, women elders provide counsel for important decisions. For the Half-King, the stakes in this upcoming negotiation couldn't be higher. Most of the region's Indians prefer the French, but if the British offer him generous trade goods to distribute among his people, an alliance with Britain could put him in a position of power. It's a dangerous gamble, but the Half-King has few options. His people are refugees who have been driven out of their homelands in the East by tribal wars and European settlers. Diseases have devastated their numbers. Now 3,000 of them have made the Ohio Country their new homeland. They guard it jealously. But with the French encroaching from the north and the English from the east, the Half-King knows he must make some kind of accommodation.
Why are they firing?
Nothing to fear. It's their way of welcome. It's when they fire their guns at the end of the parley that you need to worry.
And so let me get to this next one, 3750. So we have this open expanse of land between what is the French-controlled area, Louisiana, as they referred to it, and the English colonies along the eastern seaboard. And what's inside the Ohio River Valley is, again, rich, fertile soil that can be, there's a lot of wealth that can be extracted from those lands. And who's coming together to want to, make this initiative to go and take these lands? The speculators, the land speculators. Remember, we talked about what happened is England said, okay, here's our colony. Now we look out into those lands and they're Indian lands, but we don't respect them as Indian lands. We think of them as unoccupied land. So we will define this as part of our colony, and we will then auction it off to the land speculators, and the land speculators will then carve up parcels and sell them to people, which is the beginning of the first business enterprise in the New World, which is real estate. And again, before the British have won any wars and to claim these lands, the Ohio Company has been formed to prepare for moving into the Ohio River Valley. And who is the president of that company? Well, none other than George Washington's brother, Lawrence. Now, what is going to happen is George is, he knows his brother wants these lands. The French are doing what they're doing. Britain doesn't seem to be responding too aggressively. So George goes off to the British governor Dinwiddie, and he lobbies in favor of getting the French under control, pushing them out of the Ohio River Valley, staking a claim for England so that, you know, his brother's company can do well. And of course, George will do well. So he's working for them to move against the French. And so let's have a look at how all of this unfolds.
In June of 1755, Braddock's march to the Ohio country finally gets underway. A long, thin column of wagons, artillery, horses, and camp followers, 4 miles long. "300 axemen clear the way." It's a logistical feat that only the British would attempt. Marching an army through 100 miles of dense forest, steep mountains, and muddy river crossings. After a week, they have gone only 22 miles. Frustrated by the slow progress, Braddock splits his force and takes an advance column of 1,400 men ahead. It is Washington's third adventure into the Ohio Valley. This time, he hopes to finally drive the French out. The main body of the army escapes any direct attacks. Others aren't always so lucky. English messenger James Smith is captured far from the column and taken to the French fort Duquesne.
Move as fast as you can.
Running the gauntlet is customary for all Indian captives. Smith is turned over to the French. He'll wait to see whether the English will ever arrive at the fort. After 3 grueling weeks, the British Army finally approaches the Monongahela River, just a few miles south of Fort Duquesne. Morale is high. General Braddock has led his army nearly 100 miles. His engineers built log roads to cross the swamps. A company of sailors rigged block and tackle to hoist the heavy cannon over the hills. The worst is behind them. Once they reach the fort, nothing can stand in their way.
It is my hope that this evening we will be drinking a toast at Fort Duquesne.
Braddock has succeeded in transporting a modern army and its artillery deep into the wilderness. Washington is impressed. This is the kind of British officer the young Virginian aspires to be. Indian scouts working with the French keep a close watch on the approaching army. When word reaches Fort Duquesne of the advancing British column, the French realize their only hope is to ambush the British as they cross the Monongahela River. But their Indian allies balk, unwilling to take on the large enemy force. The French captain Léonard de Beaujeu dons Indian war dress and paints his face, a gesture of solidarity the British would never consider. The Indians agree to join the fight. At the front of the British column, George Croyan, a Pennsylvania trader, leads the 7 remaining Indian scouts, moving quickly the last few miles toward Fort Duquesne. Captain Beaujeu's force of nearly 900 Indians, Canadians, and French regulars moves just as fast toward Braddock's column, still hoping to catch them at the river crossing. It's impossible to say who is more surprised when they encounter each other deep in the woods. The elite British Grenadiers move forward. Beaujeu leads the warriors and Canadians into the woods. He'll fight the battle the Indian way. In the beginning, it looks as if the highly disciplined British will prevail. Their volleys prove deadly immediately. Beaujeu is one of the first to fall. But once the Indians and Canadians slip into the hills on either side of the British, everything changes. Washington and the other officers struggle to keep their men in formation.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to highlight, this is the Vietnam War, if you don't know. This is the Vietnam War. The British were going to fight it the way they had fought past wars. Everybody line up, and attack. We wear red coats so they can find us. The Indians are going to use more of a guerrilla warfare. They're going to, get off to the side and ambush and all of those kinds of this. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese defined the when, the where, and the how of every fight. And that was just it. And the French-Indian War is another example of the same phenomenon taking place.
The French regulars are deployed in front of the British column, blocking any forward movement. While the Indians and Canadians snipe at them from both sides. The British start to fall back, but on the narrow forest road, they collide with the troops behind them. Chaos ensues. Deadly tangles of redcoats mass together, making pathetically easy targets. The artillery proves useless in the dense woods.
We know the Indian mode.
Certainly not, sir. Mind your place.
The general's been hit!
It doesn't take long for the attackers to reach the rear of the British column. It is said that of the 54 women who marched with Braddock's army that day, only 4 returned.
No! No!
Some of the missing would turn up in Canada, ransomed from the Indians by the French. After 3 harrowing hours, it's over. The French and Indians have lost only 21 dead, while nearly 1,000 British and provincial soldiers are killed or wounded. Washington has had several horses shot out from under him, but is unhurt. What's left of Braddock's army makes a desperate retreat.
The shocking scenes which presented themselves in this night's march are not to be described. The dead, the dying, the wounded, the groans, the lamentation, the cries of the wounded for help along the road were enough to pierce a heart of adamant. The folly and consequence of opposing compact bodies against the manner of the Indians fighting in the woods, which had in a manner been predicted, were now so clearly verified.
Let's keep in mind that George there is serving the British Army. I think that's important because, you know, we sort of make a big deal out of make sure I'm going in the right direction here, about Benedict Arnold being such a horrible guy. Well, you know, Benedict Arnold was a member of the British Army. And so George really is betraying the British when he changes sides and becomes a revolutionary. What happens is the British eventually win the fight. The French give up. And there's a treaty signed between the French, the Spanish, and the British. The British get more lands as from the competition with the other invaders. But this fight has been very costly, and it nearly bankrupted France and is one of the key items that ultimately leads to the French Revolution, because they're so financially strapped. The British are also financially strapped as a result of this fight. And they say, look, we don't want to have another fight with the Indians. So mind you, the French-Indian War, 1756 to 1763. Notice we're moving closer to 1776. And so because the British don't want to have another fight, they establish the Proclamation Line. And the Proclamation Line follows the Appalachian Mountains. And what they do is they say, colonists, don't go over this line. We don't want another fight with the Indians. We can't afford it. So don't go into lands that they claim and, open us up for more fights. Remember George Washington and his brother with the Ohio Company. George Washington already has his sights set on other lands that the British are now saying you can't go to them. So George is not real happy with that. And he kind of says, well, I don't really care what they say. I'm going to still have the land surveyed as if they're going to be auctioned off any day now. And we're going to still make plans for moving into these lands. And so the Proclamation Line, this from Patrick Griffith, so called because it arose from a royal proclamation of 1763, divided the continent of North America along the spine of the Appalachians into two distinct worlds. East of the line, men and women would be governed like and conceived of as members of the British nation. To the west was considered Indian lands, but not entirely. They don't ever really recognize it as these indigenous people have claims to these spots, but they're just saying time out for now. And that, what I'm arguing, is one of the prime motivations for the American Revolution. It is that Proclamation Line. Don't go across here because we can't afford to have another war. And so this really is the second of the three-part series on American history. This is item number 16 of my 24 items that are essential for people to know to understand American history. And in our next series of classes, assuming any of you will wish to participate in that, which will start in September, it will be 8 more classes for the final 8 items. The stage is set for looking at the period before the Revolution through the Civil War. My thesis is that the traditional narrative of American history is purely a contrivance for making it all sound noble and honorable. Mind you, I think history, that's what's done. We don't know about all the brutality that took place during that period over the past 10,000 years, because we don't want people to think this is one humanly brutal world that we live in. It becomes, no, don't think that. We want it to be a story about right winning out against wrong. And so we contrive these stories of battles and wars and empires so that it is couched in the terms of, we did humanity a favor by creating the British Empire, by creating the Roman Empire. We were really good guys. We did it for God. We did it for honor. And you see, all of that is nonsense. They were doing it for serving their master who wanted ever greater wealth and power. I don't care what war you look at, any one of them. You can go and you start digging deep into the history, you're going to find that what's behind it, religious warfare, there aren't any religious wars. They're not religious wars. They are wars for power, for greed. May be done under the umbrella of religion, but that's just a platform. That's just a disguise. It's not the real, what is behind it. We didn't fight war because of races, because of religions, because of, you know, the whether you're bald or you're not. It is because of excess wealth, power, and greed. Take any one of them, dig deep into it. That's what's going to be at the root of that fight. And all the rest is public relations spin to make it seem like that's not what it's about. We don't want people to believe that they are living in a world where the most powerful can send people to war to kill other people and to be killed in service of their wealth and power. And so that really is what is the thesis behind it all, and that the real story reflects financial self-interest, preservation, and dominance. This article from Britannica I had sent to you. And so as we go, the traditional narrative is that the spirit for independence, for freedom and liberty compelled colonial leaders to fight for independence from Britain. That is not true, is my argument. It was the spirit of stealing Indian lands, killing Indians, and extracting wealth and power out of the rich, fertile soils of the Americas. The traditional narrative is they're inspired by Enlightenment ideas and the Magna Carta. A copy of the Magna Carta is on display at the National Archive. This is how far they will take this bogus argument. They will post the Magna Carta in the National Archive as if they were driven by, we want to make this the human rights of man and all that nonsense. No, they were creating a government of, by, and for the people. That is, if the people are those who are at the very top of the heap, not all of the people. The split with England was prompted by threats to money-making and power-making systems of killing Indians and taking their lands, and then deploying enslaved people in extracting wealth and power from those lands. I also argue in the next series that it was not a revolution, it was a secession. The colonists merely seceded from England. To have a revolution, there should be some revolutionary change. There was no change. They continued on killing Indians, stealing their lands, and extracting wealth by using enslaved labor. It continued on as it was before and is probably continuing today. When new technology, railroads, emerged, it provided a newer path for ever greater wealth and power. And what you had before the revolution becomes on steroids, that it is, and cotton is in demand, and the frenzy for greed will flourish. You know, England, America, the biggest customer of America was England, and England went ahead and outlawed slavery in England and aggressively worked at ending the slave trade. So slave masters would not end slavery, so they simply changed. So what you get is England, America's biggest customer, says we got to get rid of slavery for whatever the reason. The slave masters in America say that won't fly. So you got the proclamation line and you got ending slavery. Those are the two motivations behind the American Revolution. Has nothing to do with taxation. People can spew that nonsense all day long. That wasn't what made you wealthy and powerful. Paying a tax was not going to break you, but ending slavery and ending the taking of Indian lands, that meant you were being cut off from world-class wealth. And so eventually what happens is, coming up to the Civil War, we have the Civil War, we don't end slavery, all we do is we change its name and we call it Jim Crow. So what I have argued is that we don't ever really get to, we had an opportunity to right our wrongs and get on a different path. That was at the Civil War. It didn't happen. We have stayed on the same trajectory as we had from when Columbus landed. You know, what I'm saying, it represents a dramatic, my argument does, it represents a dramatic departure from the traditional narrative. You know, were they driven by ideals, or were they driven by wealth, enormous wealth? You have to think about that. And by the way, I know we're living at a time where people are spewing forth all kinds of nonsense out there. The difference and you may consider what I'm saying nonsense. The only difference is I'm actually providing resources to back up what I'm saying. You don't, none of this is an original idea in my head. All I'm doing is taking the works of real scholars, packaging it together and presenting it. The data is there in the books and in the papers that I've sent you. So I'm making this crazy departure from the traditional narrative, but I'm backing it up with something that's called evidence. You know, how colonists grew rich, you have to understand the Doctrine of Discovery. England designated native lands as belonging to England, thereby expanding their colonies. So that's what's going to be coming up. And what I'm going to say is the three pillars of the class will be slave rebellions, the Proclamation Line, and the James Somerset case in England that becomes the 5-alarm fire bell to the colonists that England's getting rid of slavery, and that may mean that they will lose slavery. So traditionally, we have Enlightenment ideas, liberty, freedom, caused by taxation and a tyrannical king. And I'm arguing, no, it was riches that were derived from Indian lands blocked by the Proclamation Line, and riches derived from using enslaved labor that was now threatened by the Somerset case, and fear of slave rebellions and Britain's ideas for arming Black people to have used them in putting down insurrections. So we now can open for any comments, discussion.
Okay. So everybody can turn their videos back on, and you can use the raise the hand function for any questions or comments. I know personally, I'm going to jump in front of you, Claire, and say that it seems like when you do readings of the time that they used that taxation notion as one of their things to gin up the masses, but it was sort of more like a Kellyanne Conway type of thing, that they used sort of alternative facts to move the narrative forward. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have two elements. One is the motivation of the leaders. The second is what they did to gin up the population to now coalesce against for this idea of fighting for independence from England. Those are two different things. And what I just went through is what I'm arguing was the motivation. What they did to gin up the population were other themes that worked effectively, and particularly they were fear of Indians massacring white people and of Black people being instigated to go and kill their slave masters. That was fake news, and that was promulgated by Ben Franklin and John Adams.
Claire, what do you have to add?
Well, I just have a logistical question. When the British Army was marching single file through the woods, how were they supplied?
Yeah, it was
so many things they can shoot. or hunt.
Yeah,
But
right. Well, no, they did establish supply lines. Again, they're drawing upon the colonists that weren't living in that area, but weren't too far away in Pennsylvania to supply them with foods and stuff like that. It was a formidable exercise, but they did it as a traditional army would do it. They've had experience with it by invading other lands, not just here. Mind you, the British have used the East India Company to invade India. And so what you have is the East India Company is like a pseudo government agency that is attacking Indians, killing many Indians, and taking over their cotton industries and that sort of thing. And so they've developed skills in being able to, the key for logistics for an army is to get bullets, water, and food to them. And that's what they learned to do. But what you see happening there is they are using, why I say this is very much like the Vietnam War. It was, this is how we do it, regardless of the circumstances, the environment. This is how we move. This is how we're going to move. And we're not going to change no matter how badly thought out it might be. Yeah.
Thank you.
Margita.
Thank you. When I look at all the presentations you have given to us, Sal, and thank you so much for that point of view. To me, and I'm looking for a solution, right? I'm not the person that says, okay, now I'm going to get into a deep depression and hide in my room and suck my thumb. No. So in order to really be able to process this, as I said last time, we need to look at a solution. And especially if we're going to tell children and educate them about the facts, we have to also give a path of hope. You can't just go boom. That doesn't work for mental health. So what I'm thinking is that there's only a political solution to this. If you look at over the millennia, who dictated history, right? By what means? By what guises? It seems to me that there has to be a truly democratic push for strong regulation of those powers of what you've called the greedy individuals, corporations, groups, whatever, putting rail guards on their way of operation to really think this through, perhaps to even get away from the form of capitalism that we have, or really regulate market capitalism in a very, with an eye of equality. And that takes enormous regulation and change in the political arena to give a truly democratic government the power to truly regulate and prevent fake news.
Let me just jump in for a second, because it's a topic that I'm certainly real interested in. What I would suggest is reading Montesquieu. Montesquieu is a French philosopher, and he was one of the most, if not the most influential, with the founding fathers in drafting the Constitution. And what he's doing is Montesquieu is really looking at things that have happened in England, how the Parliament emerged and where powers lied, what the courts did, that sort of thing. And he is theorizing about how government should be structured. And the key, at least from my reading of Montesquieu, is that you must insulate the people in government from corruption. That is the linchpin of his theories. And what he is saying is it's not, and it's not just what we would consider illegal corruption. It can be things that are legal. For example, let's say they're going to put in a road and you're on the, city council. And if the road goes by this place, it will benefit your business. And if that's the case, you should be excluded from making decisions on it. You're not taking a bribe, or you're not perpetrating a fraud. It is just, you have a self-interest. You should be insulated from that kind of corruption. And so he talks a lot about it. There's also a professor from Fordham, Zephyr Teachout is her name. I think I have her referenced in the bibliography that I sent out. And she talks about how when they adopted the Constitution, they had a rule against accepting gifts, emoluments. We heard about emoluments during the Trump administration. It's the first time you've heard about that, because people before made, at least an effort to disguise if they were being bribed. And so, like, the idea is if they're going to go, if foreign leaders are going to come and stay in Trump's hotel, that means he's getting a benefit from his being the president. These were gifts, is what they were arguing. Well, Ben Franklin had received a gift from the French government, like a jewelry box. He had to give it back because Montesquieu's ideas about you must be insulated from corruption, this gift compromises you, so you have to give it back. So it is all of those ideas. What are the rules and regulations that we put around commerce? Mind you, I'm not against capitalism by any means. I think capitalism is a certainly in the modern day an essential mechanism for the survival of any country. Mind you, the ideas of communism and all of that never were applicable in the modern day because it's just not conducive to the amount of production that we need to have. Capitalism does facilitate that. But the key issue, in and of itself, capitalism is not an evil thing. It is, how do you use it? What do you do with it? What are the rules around it? What are the guardrails? What's legal? What's illegal? Right now, we have a shortage of baby formula, right? Well, that's because you allowed people to merger, acquisition, take over. So you only got 4 suppliers. How's that a free market? So you allowed the big people to gobble up all the others. And so you don't have competition. You don't have multiple suppliers. One thing goes wrong and the whole industry collapses. So yeah, I mean, so I would really encourage the book. There's a book by Montesquieu that is readable. It's short, it's a little, and it really highlights the ideas of the 3 branches of government, what they were to do, and I think makes some really good points, which is really the structure. We talk about the Constitution. The Constitution is first and foremost an organizing document. It's an organizational document. It says, this part of government, you're responsible for these tasks. This other part of government, you're responsible for these others. And this other part of government, you're responsible for that. And it really was not meant to be something that would give you legislation in the Constitution. It was to create an organization that would create legislation. Now, mind you, the slaveholders, however, they were not going to take a chance on legislation coming as they wanted it. They wanted stuff stipulated in the Constitution protecting slavery and protecting their power, even though they never used the word slavery in the Constitution. We'll talk about that in the next class.
Yeah, but Sal, I wanted to say that, right, the real problem is we know what, most of us have studied Montesquieu a little bit, at least we know the ideas. The problem is, how do you regulate in this country at this point of all the insidious, often unknown influences of those corporations, individuals, because of the fake news brainwashing against big government. I mean, there's so many messages and forces that totally will make it impossible at this point in this country. So the question is, we know what has to be done. How do we do it? That's the real key.
No, and look, so much of what transpires in business and government and many things are things that aren't written down in laws and formal rules. The idea of respect for law. I mean, it's very important that we have people who have respect for law. And I can go down multiple Supreme Court decisions where they had nothing but contempt for the law. If you look at this draft from Alito, it says, I don't give a damn about the law. This is what I want, and this is what I'm going to put down. If you read the Heller decision by Scalia, this is mental gymnastics and nonsense. That's not respect for the law. So we need people who actually respect the law, respect that here is how we, stare decisis means something, all of that. And that, I mean, it's hard to codify everything, but I do think it is the efforts to be able to codify what Montesquieu advocates. And if we can see that happen, then it works. Where the system doesn't work today is fundamentally around corruption. I mean, you can't have children being murdered in their classrooms and a government that's incapable of doing anything about it if you don't have corruption. I mean, it's like, this is so painfully fundamental. You had Chris Murphy last night. What are we doing here? It's the obvious. When government can't respond to a deadly virus without having court rulings saying, no, you can't make people wear a mask. I mean, this is not what Montesquieu talked. That, to me, all of that is about corruption. And that's not about one political party or the other. They're all subject to corruption. I mean, when you had the greatest fraud in the history that we know of, recorded history of the world, in 2008, why is it no one goes to prison? I mean, if I did that, I would be, wearing an orange shirt. I mean, it's just, that's corruption. And it's hard to get around that. Yeah. I think you would like Zephyr Teachout's book. I think she speaks to it very, very well. Go ahead, Gail.
Okay.
Very quick note. These trains of thought always come down for me to the people who have the power to stay in power. And at some point, there's a point of no return, a critical mass, like in a nuclear reactor, when there is so much power concentrated that the power to stay in power is overwhelming. And so that's the thing that's worrisome. When have we reached that point, and what can be done?
Look, I think that when I talk about if I take the income distribution charts that show you the 0.1% skyrocketing from the 1970s. I mean, from a just pure statistical analysis, this says, uh-oh, something happened in America in 1970. And that's the unleashing of the corruption of the lobbyists and all the rest. So yeah, no doubt. It's a good indicator.
Or a bad indicator.
I stand corrected. Yes.
Do we have any other questions or comments out there? This is pretty heavy stuff, Sal.
Well, it is. We're living in a time of heavy stuff, and all of this relates to what's happening right now. At least I would hope you would see the connection to it. That what we have in the current landscape is a landscape that has been crafted over thousands of years, and we need to recognize that. If we're going to, because if you don't recognize it, then you don't see the root of the problem, and if you don't see the root, you're not going to change it.
Just like weeds in your yard. Well,
I have one thing to say, as I say all the time. Everybody get involved. You know, you have to get involved in your local politics. That's I'm with Tip O'Neill. It all starts here, and it's the only place we can start really and make an effect, but we can't. So get involved.
I'm for that.
Keep voting.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, everyone, as you know, I have a class on the history of the Earth. We're going to cover the whole thing in 6 classes.
Oh boy.
It will be a macro level, a macro level presentation. But you know, I mean, as somebody who failed everything in science, and I can show you my report card to prove it, that, you know, I think it's interesting. I've gone over this class multiple times now. I'm still making refinements, but I think it's interesting. And I think it gives us a sense of where we come from, how we emerged, and that sort of thing. And it just, for me, the idea of I own this property is so absurd. I mean, it is, no, you don't. And it really puts a lot of stuff in a perspective that I just find it valuable to have. And if you get a chance, I hope you'll enjoy it. So
yeah, you can, if you haven't already, you can sign up for Sal's class by you probably been emailed a link, but you can go right on the website, and the course registration online form is right there, ready for you. And it starts after the 4th of July, 5th or 6th, I think, 6th maybe.
So everybody have a happy 4th of July, celebrate our independence.
Our succession.
Please be safe out there. And, you know, I after the events of yesterday, it's certainly a somber time and difficult to deal with. I know it is for me. You know, I've had some experience with that stuff, and it's unimaginable, and it's heart-wrenching. So anyway, well, all be safe, be good. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks for coming, and we'll see you this summer, or we'll see you next fall.
No, be good stuff. Get rid of that.